Right, I'm going to level you here. This video was originally going to have relevant footage or every single section, but I have played this game for 200 hours and I'm still missing stuff I need. At this point, I am fucking done, at least for a few months. If script and footage incongruity bug you, then I can only but apologise. Anyway, in we go! The fact I'm late to this party, and the fact that the conversation surrounding this game has made coming into it with a level head almost impossible, means that it's very difficult to even know where to begin when it comes to reviewing DayZ. For the blessedly uninitiated, DayZ is an open world zombie survival game with an overwhelming focus on realism, that began life as a mod for Arma 2's Operation Arrowhead expansion pack. Far from being derivative, like most 2010 zombie games, DayZ is where the trend started. The mod had a meteoric rise, lifting the tail of Arma 2's sales considerably and increasing its all-time concurrency peak from a couple of thousand to almost 20k. Despite its popularity, the mod had a lot of problems. Arma 2 is less of a game than it is a sandbox for simulating combined ops battles. The game has a lot of systems that can be twisted to work in the context of a survival game, but the general bugginess, the cumbersome interactions, and the opaque mechanics present a tough new player experience and make it extremely difficult to add complicated mechanics into the game in a way that would make sense to a player. With this in mind, Bohemia Interactive announced in 2012 that it had created a new development team, one that would take the concepts of DayZ mod and turn it into a standalone title. That title would ultimately drop a year later in December 2013 to a relatively frosty reception. Today we're not going to review that, we're going to look at the PS4 port, released in August 2019. When this version of the game was announced, people were very sceptical. DayZ is an unoptimised hog that barely runs on a high-end PC. How could it hope to run on the now 6-year-old 7th gen consoles? I would love to tell you that these fears were unfounded, but unfortunately they were not. DayZ PS4 has a lot of issues. These issues run the gamut from mild annoyances all the way up to showstoppers and are ever present when playing the game. Over the 100 hours my group has spent in Chernarus, dozens have been spent battling against the game's constant desynchronization. This issue affects almost every mechanic in the game. Zombies may glitch around the play area, other players may float along the ground as their movement animations fail to trigger. Items you desperately need may get stuck inside containers, forcing you to wait for the server to restart for you to retrieve them. There have been countless times where one of my friends will have dropped an item on the ground for me, only for the item to fail to render on my side, and then fail to be pocketable on his side. When the item dropped is a short stick, the issue is annoying. When the item is a fully kitted out hunting rifle, it's infuriating. The game also has many performance issues. The average frame rate, even during calm moments, feels like it sits well below an acceptable 30 frames. This routinely drops to below 10 frames when you're in cities or are in an area with several other players. The lack of optimization also extends to the game's texture streaming system. Almost every time you turn around you will see the game fail to load something in on time. This can include trees, houses, even zombies and players. This latter category is the worst, as when character models fail to load in on time, they appear brilliant white, which makes them very easy to spot against the game's standard green background. There have been times where the game has loaded me into an area before it's loaded in any of the set dressing, allowing me to see other players running around for miles around me. This issue can get so bad that the game even occasionally fails to load in the stubs of objects in the environment, often resulting in you running into invisible cars and buses while being chased by zombies or players. Aside from being infuriating, this can completely ruin your experience. Losing a week-old character because of technical issues has probably driven thousands of players away, and a brief glance at YouTube videos from the game's launch window suggests that most of these issues have gone unaddressed for almost a year. Whether this is a programming problem that can be solved, or a hard limitation on releasing the game on PS4 hardware is unclear, but either way, if your capacity to accept junk is very low, DayZ PS4 is a game I have a very hard time recommending. Like most survival games, the core loop of DayZ is very easy to describe. You spawn into a large, sparsely populated area and must survive the local flora and fauna whilst hunting for better gear. If you don't eat, you will starve. If you don't drink, you will dehydrate. If you don't find warm clothes, you will freeze. If you don't eat, drink and find warm clothes in quite the right way, you'll get sick. Initially, juggling the needs of your character may seem intimidating, even impossible. DayZ communities online are cluttered with first time players complaining that to them, the entire game seems to consist of spawning on the coast as a fresh character, running around looking for food, and then starving, dehydrating, or freezing 20 minutes later. Experienced players know that managing your character's needs is actually quite easy, but the game does an absolutely terrible job of onboarding new players. The game's tutorial is essentially a very uninformative PowerPoint presentation that tells you nothing useful. To actually learn the game, you either have to spend dozens of hours banging your head against the opaque controls and mechanics, or you go online and watch videos. Once you have the basics of survival down, you can then begin to head inland, as the further toward the top left of the map you go, the better the gear gets. There are several places on the map that have become hotbeds of player activity, all centred around military loot installations where the game's best gear can be found. These places offer high-risk, high-reward adventures for the more daring players, but it has to be said there are safer places where decent gear can be found. There are many central areas that have military tents, and in these tents can be found decent military-grade submachine guns. It seems to run counter to what Call of Duty-style game design has taught us about reactivity versus proactivity in game design, but in a DayZ console edition battle between a cheap submachine gun and an endgame assault rifle, the winner will almost always be the person who had the element of surprise. Herein lies the biggest difference between DayZ console edition and its PC brother. PC players have the advantage of mouse aim, which makes very long-range battles significantly more viable. On the PS4, long-range battles are very tough, as the precision required to make fine adjustments for aim across a difference of mere pixels just does not exist. This is exacerbated by the fact that anytime you aim down the sights of your weapon, the frame rate at least halves. Aggressive players in DayZ mod would sit on a hill and patiently wait for you to stumble into their kill field. Aggressive players in DayZ console edition will hunt for victims in towns and cities, using stalking tactics to get the upper hand. This makes for a refreshing change of pace. Not once in my many trips to Chernarus or Electro, two of the game's largest towns, have I randomly been shot in the face from half a kilometre away. This was an almost daily occurrence in DayZ mod, and one that I am glad has not made its way to the console standalone. The most common criticism of the DayZ mod was that there was nothing to do once you were geared except find PvP. Despite some semi-interesting additions to the formula by Bohemia, that remains largely true. Players can now craft persistent crates that can be used to store gear for long periods of time. It can be very fulfilling to go on gear runs and then stash what you find in the woods. I personally have a massive cache of weapons, ammunition, survival items and clothing far in the northern woods. For further protection from the prying eyes of other players, these crates can be buried, as can chests and dry bags, leaving nothing behind but a circle of disturbed earth. I've come across many unearthed crates during my time with the game, but I've never managed to notice a buried one. Alternatively, players can stake a far more visible claim to the areas they inhabit by starting a base. Bases are complicated structures that take many play sessions to build. The resources required to build even small bases necessitate many hours hunting in the industrial areas of the game's most dangerous towns looking for tools and nails. The building process itself usually requires multiple steps per construct added to the environment. For example, erecting a fence requires the player to construct a fence kit, which is simple enough to build, consisting of 2 sticks and a length of rope. Once that's done, the fence kit is placed on the ground, across the land the player wants to build a fence on. The player then needs to cut down trees until they have 2 logs to lay across the fence kit. At that point, the player can then dig foundations for the logs and prop them up. Then, more trees need to be cut down, so those logs can be turned into planks using a handsaw. Once these planks are in a player's inventory, they can then be applied to the fence posts, along with a box of nails, and attached using a hammer. If this sounds laborious, it's because it is. It took me several hours of persistent hunting to find 2 boxes of 70 nails each, and a modest base out in the wilderness can consist of more than a dozen fences, each requiring more than 30 nails. It's possible to build inside towns, and even shore up existing buildings with defences and locks. The thing is, base raiding is absurdly easy in DayZ. There's nothing a player could do to secure a base that another player cannot undo with 5 minutes of effort. The only way to be sure your base is secure is by placing it in an obscure place. Even then, it will be found eventually. It's just a matter of how long your clever positioning has bought you before you have to start again. Fortunately, clever positioning can buy you weeks, because the map in DayZ is absolutely massive. Chernarus is almost 250 km squared, and it takes almost 2 hours to run from corner to corner. The flow of the game means that players mostly stick to 4 or 5 hotbed areas, so the forests on the edge of the map are usually free from player footfall. However, this tendency to let your guard down in the game's quieter areas can and will get you killed. Quiet does not mean dead, and you can be comfortably assured that every town in the game will be visited by a player at least once or twice a day. Poring over an extra diegetic map with your friends to find a good base spot can lead to sprawling debates about player psychology, available infrastructure, and security versus convenience. This is probably a good moment to mention the fact that DayZ does not have a built-in map. You simply cannot know where you are unless you already know your way around the game, or you're consulting an outside source for navigation. My group uses a third-party service called iSurvive, but others do exist. I think this may be one kowtowing to realism too far for DayZ. Maps exist in the game, but they are largely useless. It would not detract from the experience in any way to spawn players in with a detailed map. Learning to navigate using landmarks and learning how to work out where you are via street signs is a great experience, which would be made even better if the game had an in-game version of a shortcut every player takes anyway. Ultimately, while my group did build a base and we do store stuff there, most of the loot I find that I want to personally use I keep in my respawn stash. In the weeks I've been playing the game, I've never seen another player within a kilometre of it. When I am there dropping stuff off, or withdrawn items for a new spawn, it brings me an immeasurable amount of satisfaction to know that I'm the only person who's been there lately. This magpie-like approach to the game's core loot is fun and interesting, but once you have a certain amount of loot to your name, you're just wealth hoarding. This is fine on PC, but rendered infuriating on console by the game's bizarrely non-functional inventory UI. I think above everything else, this is the worst thing about DayZ Console Edition. Simple interactions like moving an item from your inventory to the ground can turn into a 30-second battle, as the L2 and R2 buttons you use to quickly switch between containers fails to scroll the right-hand pane down to the container you're currently highlighting. Moving items between containers is also unnecessarily cumbersome, sometimes failing for reasons that the game does a poor job of communicating to the player. For example, you can put a bag inside another bag, but you can't put an item inside a bag and then put that bag in another bag. This makes sense in the real world, but makes little sense in a world where a bag is 30 slots in size, but a full bag is also 30 slots in size. When you reach what we will reductively refer to as endgame, it's quite possible to have dozens of crates stored in the same location. Managing the contents of these crates is a nightmare so large it actively drives me away from playing the game further. On PC, you have the advantage of mouse drag to move objects around. On PS4, you have the horrendous tabs and pane system. In my professional life, I don't like to highlight a problem without also suggesting a solution, so in that spirit, let's brainstorm ways the inventory UI could be improved. Number 1, first and foremost, there needs to be a pass to deal with how basic interaction works. A mouse cursor controlled by the left or right stick is so much better, I'd almost say it's a solved problem. The UX in games like No Man's Sky and Destiny 2 is not perfect by any means, but it's a damn sight better than it is in DayZ. You could even have a system whereby you could switch between the current interaction system and a virtual mouse-driven one, so situations the current setup handles quite quickly, like moving an object from your hands into your bag, could remain snappy. Secondly, make the containers collapsible. It'd be so much easier to deal with the contents of crates if you could collapse their tabs in the inventory panes. Scrolling through 10 boxes to get to the thing you need is a complete pain in the ass. Thirdly, use the right stick to quickly scroll through the active pane. This would make moving through lots of boxes much faster and would go a long way to fixing the annoying scroll bar bug. Lastly, add an item to the game called a label maker that takes a battery and paper and spits out sticky labels you can use to name crates. Most players have an organisational system they use in their bases and stashes, so it would be advantageous if you could ascertain what was in a box without opening the inventory UI first. These systems are by no means quick wins, and I doubt we will ever truly see them, but the more I play the game, the more I think they are necessary if Bohemia wants to keep the game alive on console for the same amount of time it's been alive on PC. The inventory system is an integral part of the game's crafting system, so if you're a player who likes to build stuff, you're going to be rubbing up against these issues very often. The crafting system itself is very detailed and very well thought out. Reviewers often criticise how the crafting works, but personally I think it's ingenious. There seems to be a design focus amongst the DayZ developers whereby every interaction in the game has to be driven through the player's hands. If you want to dig, you need to be holding a shovel. If you want to attach duct tape to something to repair it, you need to be holding both the item and the duct tape. If you want to put meat on a stick to cook it, you need to be holding both the meat and the stick. Personally, I think that this focus significantly increases immersion. It doesn't make sense in a game as systems driven as this one is, to just press X on an item in your inventory to have it immediately take effect. Bandages are applied by wrapping them around an injury, food needs to be chewed, canned beans cannot be opened with your bare hands. This dedication to the painful realities of survival draws you in and makes more empathetic players really identify with their characters. The list of minor scrapes and catastrophic injuries my current character has survived over the course of her 30-hour life would fill several books. I'll be gutted when she dies, and having every decision I make in game move through her calloused hands only serves to crank up the investment I have in the game. I mentioned moments ago that the game is very systems driven. I'm going to use this as an excuse to discuss several small systemic touches I've noticed that really ramped up my love for the game. The game obviously tracks your temperature. If you get too cold it can hurt you, so when it's cold it pays to be standing near a fire. I realised in one of my first play sessions that if you cook meat and place the cooked steaks into your character's jacket, the heat from the food will keep them warm as the steaks cool down. If your character gets caught in the rain, you can develop a cold, so it pays to stand by a fire until your clothes dry out. If you can't do that, you can take your clothes off one item at a time and wring the water out of them. If you share a canteen or pass items back and forth with a person who is currently sick, or just spend too much time near them, you will also in turn get sick. You can treat all your items with disinfectant though to clear the germs on them. The game is full of non-systemic nods towards realism as well. Anytime you see a clock in the game, it will show the accurate server time. The game's map is laid out incredibly realistically, with power lines always moving towards settlements and train tracks that move and split in sensible directions. Almost unbelievably, you can navigate by star at night. Finding the North Star will predictably point you north. From there you can find all the real world constellations and watch them move realistically across the night sky. It's tiny little details like this that have really endeared the game to me. Most players won't play long enough to find this stuff, and I've never seen a professional review talk about them either, because the reviewer is never given enough time to really dig into the meat of the game. This sort of stuff, more than anything else, is what separates DayZ from other games in the survival genre. So, we know the game is a bit of a technical mess, and we know that the minute-to-minute act of playing it can be very tedious. Why then do so many people play it every single day? Why are there dozens of highly populated servers across both PS4 and Xbox One? The answer is other players. The fleeting nature of each character and the ever-present feeling of dread that constantly builds up as you find more and more solid loot permeates every second of gameplay in DayZ. The fact that the longer you play a character and the more careful and tactical you become in your playstyle, the larger the explosion of adrenaline that occurs when you do bump into another player cannot be overstated. The fact that you could be being watched at any moment, the duality of the players you find, some who'll kill you and eat you, some who'll ask, "Do you need anything?" and then move on with a lighter load. The game truly is a sandbox for sociopaths, and it is all the better for it. It's very easy to make weary alliances or bitter enemies in DayZ. The concept of base building has also resulted in players sticking to a central server, which means that you're almost guaranteed to see the same players often. My friend has been hunting for the man who killed him for the first time for the last week, and every time he sees his name on the online list, he vows revenge. One day, that player is going to eat a shotgun to the face fed to him by my friend, and for us, it's going to be yet another incredible memory fabricated by gaming's #1 emergent story generator. The fighting itself can be a mixed bag in DayZ. Melee attacks are mostly used on zombies, and while the current system is entirely functional, it is very cumbersome, and the aforementioned desync issues can make putting down large creeps harder than it needs to be. The gunplay in a vacuum is pretty incredible. The guns all feel unique and have truly incredible sound work. Hearing a high caliber gunshot in the distance is terrifying, and one-shotting a player from a distance with a hunting rifle as the shot echoes around you is intensely satisfying. It is, however, let down massively by the poor performance. As mentioned earlier, aiming down the sights can cause pop-ins so bad it stutters the game, sometimes for upwards of 2 full seconds. Many fights have probably been decided by one player having been facing in a more opportune direction for the game's rendering pipeline. The damage model on players is also very realistic. A couple of well-placed 9mm bullets will drop a player, even if they're wearing high-end gear. In this, more than any other game, positioning is key. It's important to have good aim, but it's even more important to have a methodical approach to combat, which is difficult when you take into consideration the state of sheer panic the game can put you in. More than anything else, DayZ is a game of extremes. Camping out in a remote house at night with the rain hammering on the windows and 4 buddies cooking and laughing around a hastily made campfire is one of the most therapeutically relaxing experiences I've ever had in a video game. The level of immersion this can elicit is so complete that there have been times when I've turned my console off at 12 AM and actually felt like I've just arrived home. On the other hand, the thrill of spotting a player, then carefully stalking them to get an idea of what they're carrying and what they may be capable of, before deciding their ultimate fate, is a thrill unlike anything else. The first few times you get into an altercation with another player in DayZ will leave you in a state of adrenaline-fueled euphoria. This game has made my heart race and my hands shake in a way that I've only ever experienced in EVE Online, another high-stakes PvP game. The fact that a fear this potent can be extracted from the game with an investment of only a few hours is one of its greatest strengths. Nothing can take away from the sheer density of atmosphere that DayZ can elicit, but similarly, there is no ignoring the sheer volume of technical issues that plague the game. Bohemia Interactive have recently shuttered their Bratislava studio, where the majority of console development was reportedly happening. Despite the fact that they issued a press release soon after stating that their Prague studio is continuing the development of the game, I am not hopeful for the future of DayZ's console ports. I think the fact that this engine runs on these hardware configurations at all is incredible. I don't think we're ever going to see stable builds of this game on console. I think the best we can hope for is for them to patch up the most glaring issues like the desync and keep the game roughly at feature parity with the PC version. If it seems like I've ragged harshly on DayZ across these last 4,000 words, know that it's from a place of love. I fell immediately in love with the mod and have come to love the console edition of the standalone in a similar way. The emergent chaos of interacting with other players, the harsh survival mechanics, the peaceful solitude of the Russian wilderness, and the heart-pounding tension of a Northwest airfield run. It was true in 2012 and it's true now. There is nothing quite like DayZ.